Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Last time, we answered two frequently asked questions about the model of criminal liability, having to do with efficient offenses and with the rationality of offenders. Here's a third frequently asked question that's suggested by the technique that we've described earlier as probability scaling. One of the first economists to write seriously about the application of economic reasoning to the problem of crime and punishment was the great American economist Gary Becker, who teaches at the University of Chicago and published in 1968 a wonderful journal article that was the first serious attempt to apply economic theory in detail to the problem of criminal punishment. In the course of this article, Professor Becker makes an argument for probability scaling criminal punishments. He notes that the operation of a criminal justice system is expensive. It's not cheap to operate a police force to apprehend offenders. It's not cheap to operate a court system to adjudicate their guilt and determine their penalties. And it's especially not cheap to operate a system of prisons that inflicts punishment upon convicted offenders in the name of compensating the indirect victims of their crimes. Where it costs a great deal of money to invoke the criminal liability system against an individual offender, it would be far better if people simply didn't commit those crimes and we didn't have to invoke the criminal liability system and its attendant expenses quite as often. And so Professor Becker prescribes probability scaling. If punishment is uncertain, he says, lower the probability that any offender will be captured and punished at all as far as possible, and then raise the severity of the punishment that's inflicted on that unlucky few as far as possible, so that when you multiply that low probability by that very high punishment, you get an expected liability price which is sufficient to deter people from committing inefficient offenses. And this raises the third question, which is just that. If apprehension and trials are costly, why not probability scale criminal punishments and sentence just one or two offenders very, very severely so as to encourage the others? Notice, just as in our earlier discussion of probability scaling, if we could get the values right, if we could get the probability right and the severity right, we could produce an expected liability price for every potential offender, even those who are not going to be caught, that would just internalize the costs of their crime. But if things don't work, we can present them with precisely the same incentive in the form of an expected liability price, and this will generate, in principle, the same number of crimes as would perfect enforcement and perfect matching of price and cost. So indeed, if we could do probability scaling, it might be a very efficient way to control the level of crime at the efficient level by not invoking the criminal justice system very frequently at all. The problem, of course, is the norm of proportionality. Compensatory liability systems can't do this. They're constrained by strong norms of justice. In the United States, they're constrained by the Eighth Amendment, which forbids the imposition of cruel and unusual punishments. They're prohibited. Liability systems are prohibited from inflicting the kinds of disproportional punishments that probability scaling would require. American criminal justice, like American tort liability, requires that in each and every case, the amount of liability that is imposed on a defendant held liable be proportioned or equal to exactly the amount of cost that this person's tortious or criminal act has imposed upon other people. It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but it's never an eye for a tooth. Punishments and liability generally must be proportioned to the harm that is done by the particular cost imposer upon whom the liability price or punishment is imposed. And so compensatory liability systems simply cannot inflict the kinds of super proportional punishments that would be required by any effective system of probability scaling. They're all constrained by the norm of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but not an eye for a tooth. The system won't tolerate the severe punishment of people beyond the cost that they've imposed so as to produce incentives for other people who are not caught to behave in particular ways. What this means, interestingly enough, is that when the probability of apprehension and the payment of compensatory liability price, when that probability is less than 1, okay, when the probability that somebody will not pay is greater than 0, then the expected liability prices will be too low to induce the efficient number of crimes. Again, to use an example I used before, if I commit a crime that imposes $100 worth of cost, but there's only a 1 in 5 chance that I will be caught, and when I am caught, I'm only imposed a punishment of $100, then the next time I'll face only an expected punishment of $20 for a crime that actually imposes a cost of $100. And that's because the norm of proportionality has prevented the court from inflicting upon me a punishment greater than the $100 that my offense imposed upon other people, despite the fact that only 1 offender in 5 has been caught. In such a circumstance, offenders face an expected price for their crimes, which is significantly smaller than the costs that those crimes actually impose, and that will induce inefficient crimes. So, for example, if I got a benefit of $70 from committing a crime, and the expected cost to me of committing the crime were only $20, I'd commit the crime. And this despite the fact that when I commit the crime, I impose $100 worth of cost and get only $70 worth of benefit. That's inefficient. And it's inefficient because I face an expected liability price that is too low to internalize all the costs of my crime. Therefore, too many crimes will be committed for efficiency's sake if uncertainty is present and probability scaling is not allowed. And this leads us to our last frequently asked question. So, if criminal liability is prevented from achieving systemic efficiency, as I'm calling it, through probability scaling, in allocating the costs of crimes and the costs of controlling them through probability scaling, if it's not trying to produce the efficient number of crimes, what is it trying to do? And the answer is, it is trying to internalize the costs of individual crimes one at a time by ensuring that for every case that comes before the liability system, liability prices are set as close as possible to the costs of this particular kind, and liability prices are paid in kind to indirect victims, even though this means that the expected liability prices are too low and far more crimes are committed than would be systemically efficient. This is a result that economists find it exceptionally difficult to accept. Economists, like Professor Becker, believe that the goal to be sought by criminal justice ought to be what I'm calling systemic efficiency, and that is to make sure that only efficient crimes are committed and only inefficient crimes are deterred, and that this can be achieved through probability scaling. But because probability scaling is unavailable to the American system of criminal justice, punishments can't be set high enough to internalize costs when there is uncertainty of apprehension and the requirement that compensation be paid, and thus many more crimes than are systematically or systemically efficient will be committed under this regime. Instead, the system is trying to maximize the number of cases in which an accurate liability price is extracted from an individual offender and paid to that individual offender's victim.